head of data account. We're back for our third installment in our Operational Clarity's MetricTree Masterclass. I've been talking about this one in all the other sessions, so I hope you all got the message to come with this one. I'm really excited. We're going to be talking about advice and best practice. I'll introduce our guests in just a moment. I just wanted to give a bit of kind of admin update. So hopefully you guys have used this Demio tool before, but if not, if you have any questions, please go ahead and drop them in the chat. If you just want to kind of say hello as well, I'll be keeping an eye on that throughout the session. So please just drop questions in at any time. We have some time set aside at the end for Q&A, so some of those might be kind of logged to the end. But yeah, go ahead and use the chat to ask whatever you want. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started then. So it's time to introduce our guest. We're joined by Callum Ballard, who is the new analytics director at Omaze. How are you doing, Callum?
Yeah, good, thanks. Yeah, I'm on my 2 weeks between jobs, so yeah. Omaze coming up soon. Yeah,
if you saw the early description of this event, for a couple of people might have different positions, so very exciting times. We're also joined by Michael Rogers, who's the Associate Director of Product Analytics at Bumble. Michael, how are you?
Very well, thank you. Again, yeah, equally, I start Monday, so all change.
They're not due to data, I should say. Like, they're not just starting in their data role to like next week, so that they have to just different companies. And lastly, by William Mahmood from Mubi. How are you doing, Will?
I'm really good, and I just want to reassure everyone I'm still working on
these. Yes, very true. Well, great, guys. I think we'll go ahead and just dive into the first question that we've got for you. So how did you first come across metric trees? Maybe Callum, we'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, it was some time ago in my previous life in consulting. So we had a partner where I worked who kind of was very into this idea of, like, we call them issue trees then. So like if you're trying to solve like a problem that seemed very high level and a little bit hard to approach, what were the things that you could do to kind of break that down into smaller and smaller constituent parts? That kind of translated almost one for one from like a general conceptual idea of, like, you know, company has declining sales, how do you break down that problem, into something that's more like what we would be describing in this session as like a metric tree. So maybe your headline thing, rather than is like issue, you have declining sales, it's more like, okay, this is my metric of total sales per week, let's say. And actually, what are the things that you can do to break that down? So in the kind of context of consulting, like, they were super useful for helping to like both communicate like a problem that a client might be having, but then also like motivating like the proposed solutions and the proposed advice that you were giving as consultants. Like, you could very easily link that initial problem that they were having with, you know, this is what we say is your potential remedy or potential solution, and like this is how you can link the two. So yeah, I found them useful for both like organizing and structuring our thinking, but they were also really good tools for helping to like communicate both the, I suppose, diagnosis of their problems and then the solutions that you wanted to give. So yeah, they were great in consulting, and they've obviously translated into an in-house role as well.
Yeah, I think that's the consulting route is a common one, but something you said actually reminded me of something I neglected to say at the start, which is why I invited you three on specifically in the first place. So just a bit of context. I've spoken to each of you. You guys have each built metric trees in, well, some of you, your previous jobs, well, a lot of your current jobs, and before that, you have a lot of exposure to them. So yeah, it was good to get you guys on to hear how, you know, we're going to be talking about how you came across them, how you use them, what's been your approach, just really kind of tangible real life experiences for this. So yeah, Callum, thanks for kicking us off with the origin story, I guess, for you on metric trees. Michael, how about you? How did you first come across metric trees?
So very similar. Lack of imagination. I started my career in consulting, and so when you're prepping for a lot of these consulting jobs, you do a case study, and one of the big things you get taught is this sort of issue tree technique. So Victor Cheng is a really great guy, has like a case study interview. So for me, that's where it started. And then it's very common to use them and build something like that in kind of Excel, Google Sheets in consulting. And then when I moved into the startup world, I found people were calling these things like business equations, was a lot of what PMs used. Like, what's my business equation? A lot of the FP&A teams I worked with called, like I said, growth models. I was like, oh, these are all the sort of same thing that just keep showing up again and again. And so yeah, it's great now that we have kind of reincarnation, calling it MetricTrees, but very familiar with using them throughout my career.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. There's a lot of you guys both touched on like other similar concepts. We covered that on last week with Ergist as well, like how the origins of MetricTree is actually really muddled with all these other like really similar concepts. And Will, how about you?
Yeah, so well, somewhat similarity at the start of my career as well, but I started out actually at a startup in a data team, and this was about 12 years ago, so showing my age. It was also done in Excel, and to kind of pick up on the kind of business trends at the time, it was when sort of social networking was the thing. If you wanted a big valuation, that's what you were focused on. And it was very much the lean analytics movement as well. And that was the context that we kind of started implementing at this time. I was completely new to data, just learning SQL. This was done in Excel. I think Tableau was just coming up. AWS was still dominant in cloud warehousing. And yeah, it was a really beautiful, striking thing to see. I also was struck by the fact that it was really stretching the limits of Excel. But it was a really great exercise because we were all seeing what we would, what our different interactions were influencing each other. One could argue that it was also there was a big risk of data overload as well. But I think that's also a function of Excel. So count is brilliant because actually you can kind of zoom in and out and you don't have that issue anymore. And you can kind of just zero in and show a lot of information, but with some clarity as well. But yeah, at the start of my career, and glad to be picking it up again.
Yes, it must be interesting to see how it's come back around, this like in vogue again. Yeah, very interesting. Great. One of the biggest questions, or most frequent questions that we've been asked, not just in this kind of series of webinars, but just more broadly, whenever I post about this, whatever it is, people are always asking where to begin. Do you have to start in a certain part of the business? Do you need to go get approval? How do you just begin this process of starting a tree? Let's say, I think a lot of people on here agree that it's a really valuable thing and they just kind of want some guidance on where to begin. So maybe you can kind of give us some insights on where you started, maybe a recent tree that you've done, how that kind of project is kicked off. Maybe Will, because we can start with you.
Sure. So I think this is a basic context. So Mubi is like a streaming service for art house films. And I think the context for us using these MetricTrees was in the sort of our product analytics work, product data science work. And essentially, me and the VP of product were sort of, and I'm fairly new to Mubi actually. So I've been at Mubi now about 2 years and 3 months.
Way longer than these guys.
Yeah. And then and yeah, we were actually trying to sort of overhaul sort of some of our metrics. So there was really quite good data maturity at Mubi, lots of metrics the different teams are focused on, marketing, content, and obviously within the product organization. But we felt that it was time to move more towards a more of an engagement North Star metric. So again, with streaming, the business is fairly straightforward. It's how long can you keep people subscribing to your service. The challenge then, though, from our perspective in the product areas, we're now trying to decide what to focus on, what to prioritize, and we need a clearer way of understanding how different parts of our product are actually driving value. And it's not always clear how different elements are influencing retention. So, it was a really powerful exercise, important exercise in kind of shifting from a business-focused North Star, like memberships, for instance, to a product one. And for us, it was clear what is the utility of the product. I'm sure we'll talk more about, how to get started and how to flesh these things out. But that was sort of the context for us. So it was defining a product-focused North Star metric, and there was a lot of from the different teams, a lot of kind of convincing needed to be done. And so showing these relationships and how actually these are the kind of metrics we should be focusing on and convincing them, that was all, really why we leaned on using a metric tree.
So very top-down approach. And then you mentioned the convincing, and we've got a question coming up on that, but so maybe I'll hold off and you can tell a bit more about how you got people bought into it in a moment. I think that's also a really big part of this. But yeah, it's interesting to hear. I think that's the most frequent way I hear anyway, is that top-down approach of, we need to set North Star, we need to, this is why we need a metric tree to make it work. But Michael, I think you had a slightly different experience. Is that fair? Yeah. Oh, I think you're on mute, or I can't hear you. I don't know. Can you guys hear him? No? No. Okay, Callum, maybe we'll go to you. Michael. Yeah, Callum, we'll go to you, then Michael will come back.
That's right. Yeah, I think our experience, or at least my personal experience of developing them, is that it was very much focused in linking the very high level business metrics. So like your total like user LTV, for example, which is like this big company goal over here. And thinking about like how a specific pillar of the product organization can actually contribute to that. So I guess the example from my previous role, you had a few different revenue generating features, one of which was like this newer feature, which was like this debit card proposition. So like, how can you demonstrate like some of the impact that minutiae of like this debit card could have actually like on the top line of LTV? So starting with that big number at the top, like the different product pillars could, create their own individual trees. But for us, within that bit of the product organization, it was very much around like, okay, well, how do we contribute to that number? Knowing that, there are other areas of the business that will also contribute. And like, how do the metrics that we care about as like product squads and looking at kind of the low level things, like actually how does that contribute to things that the C-suite care about or like the commercial team care about? That was kind of like our experience of like going from that quite granular low level place to kind of demonstrating how we were having impact overall.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, the context as well, is because you were kind of sitting within the product team, right? You guys were embedded within this product team, which I think is kind of different than, well, you guys are structured as like a standalone data team, and so you were kind of almost advising the VP of product. Is that just people by context, different setups?
Yeah, but we are sort of, we are somewhat embedded, so we're embedded in the product organization.
Oh, okay.
But we still work and work with all the other teams at Mubi as well. So again, it's very much a sort of a new data team, but we work for the whole business. We focus on the product side for various reasons, mostly around that's sort of one of the big areas of opportunity to leverage data. We're at this sort of crossroads now with quite a mature product. Where do we go next? So data is really instrumental there. But also there's a lot of synergies between the modeling we might do or the data work that we do, and then for potential products that we might want to build and solutions for the other teams. So us being there in that kind of part of the organization helps us kind of identify those and deliver those types of solutions. So, but yeah, no, we work across the whole business.
Okay, thanks.
But are embedded at the same time.
Okay, one of those, yeah. Yeah. Michael, how are we doing? No. Maybe check your, if you go to open settings in the top, sorry for the live IT support, maybe just check your inputs and stuff there. But
Yeah,
maybe we'll oh.
Does that work?
Yeah, good.
Oh, headphones are gone. Of where, I think the focus there was a lot more sort of trying to understand people's impacts or areas of focus. I think ours was very tactical of just laying out the dynamics of the business. So in terms of where we began, we focused with a dollar number, and my sort of recommendation is start with a very simple thing you can count and kind of decompose it. So whether that's users, dollars, whatever your thing is. So yeah, we started with dollars, broke that down into very clear components to understand the dynamics of the business and say, year to year, why are things changing, where to focus, kind of bring that cohesion across the business. So we found that focusing on being very clear with very precise compositions and things that ladder up to that dollar number allowed us to go quite deep quite quickly to understand where and why things are moving. So that'd be my recommendation, really.
Yeah, that's interesting. You guys all kind of talked about starting at the highest point, I guess, within your domain that you're talking about, and then bringing it down into something like really tangible. So I think that helps kind of outline another question later, like where do you stop? I think that's a good kind of outline of both where you should be starting at the high point, but then also kind of looking down where you want to end the tree. On that, I think part of starting is also getting approval, getting buy-in. Michael, do you have any kind of advice for people on how to do that?
Yeah, so the things we found that work are when people see this, it's very intuitive. Will sort of mentioned it at the beginning of his experience when he first came across them. I think naturally this isn't something you need to fight too much for. That people kind of, once they see it, go, oh wow, this is great. Sometimes people aren't really going to ask for it. So finding a really common use case where this can just be brought up very naturally and people can understand it. So people might have weekly trading meetings, they might have a product review, it might be planning. What are those forums? Or just one very clear use case where it's like, this is a place we already talk about metrics, but we talk about 5 metrics and we never understand how they link together. This provides a really nice framing for how to do that. So I think once you start doing that, you've already got a place where people are familiar with the kind of language that you're going to be talking about, and it will naturally get picked up. And then they'll start asking you to do more, build it out even further, add proxy metrics. It will get very complicated very quickly. But this is, a great place to start.
Yeah, I think that's a good, like, where people are used to seeing these numbers anyway, and you're just kind of shifting the presentation of them. Yeah, you don't necessarily need to get approval for that, right? It's just kind of an enhancement in your,
100%.
To be obvious. And Will, you mentioned when you were going through your story a moment ago about how you needed to get other teams on board. So you kind of had the buy-in of, you had a partner with you in the VP of product, but you needed to get these other teams on board with it. How did you approach that?
So I think we immediately realized and knew our businesses, we're all actually influencing each other to a very high degree. I think there are lots of businesses like that, but certainly in the streaming space, sort of when you're building the product, like you're heavily beholden to the content that's on the product, the way that content's being marketed, the CRM activities that are going on around, and vice versa. All the other teams are beholden to sort of the way the product is exposing the content and servicing it, and how our personalization algorithms are working. All of that, all of what we do is influence each other. And I think that was one of the big opportunities that we saw. Was first of all, we need to show these dynamics quite clearly between the different teams. And so they were essential to be brought on board. So it was about making sure I think it was relevant to them all. So showing sort of like, okay, if we're looking at the world from an engagement perspective or a utility perspective, in our case, viewing, what needs to be true to drive a viewing, and then we sort of work backwards there. And actually, thankfully, we could see in the data, we're going down the right path, and you can see, right, actually, problem 1, we've got some users that are not visiting. So that's an essential, to watch something, you've got to be on the platform. And then immediately then you've got the stories that can resonate with CRM and marketing. And actually we have further segmentations as well of our users that can connect back to churn and business outcomes. And then on the product side as well, we can go into this kind of consideration funnel of the tree. And we have quite I would say, a non-conventional tree. Maybe touch on that later. But essentially it's 3 trees really that represent a funnel. And again, that's partly why as well. So this is us kind of trying to show for each team and make the tree relevant at a strategic level. But certainly on the consideration part, one thing that's been interesting is you need to, when you're on the platform, consider films. So we've represented all these different metrics around that aspect. And that's been great because the product team can say, okay, what things are we doing that we are actually probably uniquely focused on and influential in? And yeah, I think from that perspective, it's about making the content really relevant to a bunch of teams, but it should always be done in a way that's actually makes sense, right? So for us, our activities are all influencing each other, and our goal is to try and get everyone behind a shared goal and North Star framework. And that kind of approach is really relevant to us. It may not be as relevant to other teams, but for us, that's what we're trying to do, and it looks like it's working quite well.
Yeah, I like that. I think what sticks out to me, I guess, is the being empathetic part. I think by saying, this is a problem that you guys face. We all maybe feel like we're not working on the right things, or we're not on the same page. This is something that can help with that. Here's why we're building it. I think it's important to. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say another kind of point as well. It's probably good kind of just advice as well. Is you've got to obviously make sure that you've got content for those different groups that you want to be engaged by this. But I think I've really loved how with Count, they can actually go in and check it regularly. So we did have some kind of some monthly reporting we did with our top level strategic tree. That was kind of key in kind of building kind of interest in it and kind of showing people how do you interpret this and go through it. But just having this place people can visit naturally is key as well. And certainly, we have now a mini roadmap where we're trying to make sure that we're kind of keeping people aligned there. And certainly the work is still going on. Like we're still sort of getting teams fully on board here. There are still, other goals and priorities that specific teams will have when they're sort of reporting about their business impact. So there's going to be not necessarily attention, but just how do you actually kind of sit side by side with that. But I think it's working reasonably well. So give people relevant content and use a tool like Count so they can go in there and actually use it.
Yeah, I think it's especially talking about, in your context, bringing all these different teams together. Like you said, it's important to have a place that is visible to everyone. It's really clear how everything's made, like very transparent, and it's just one source of truth. I think Ergis said on Tuesday, one of the things he was really passionate about is that MetricTree shouldn't have filters on it. Like it should all be the same view for everyone. It's not like a typical dashboard that you're trying to create where people can slice and dice and look at things differently. Like a tree is a tree. It should represent the business. It should be clear. So yeah, I think having one place, like you're saying, to check everything could be really powerful. Callum, I wanted to go to you because I think you had also a different experience getting approval as well in this context for Pyatt, maybe.
Yeah, I would just say I've had great success adding filters and segmentation to trees for what it's worth. That's really powerful sometimes. Anyway, that's a different conversation. I guess in terms of like getting buy-in per se, like, and maybe it's the nature of the business that I was doing this at, where like there was a relatively high level of data literacy and like analysts were embedded across the business already. But like my approach was just to go and do it. And then when I showed people, particularly, there was one conversation that sticks out with like the head of commercial, and he was just like, "Oh my God, why are we using anything else?" And I think like I'm gonna enter my shilling for Count mode at this point. But the problem I think, particularly previously, is that like there are no good tools otherwise that really unlock the full power of this using like live data, right? So like at a previous job, I tried to use Tableau to build a MetricTree, and it was the most horrible experience of my data career. Like it was very, very clunky. The user experience on the other end of it was not great. So like having something that exists in that strictly 2 dimensions that allows you to like visualize, okay, this is your metric. These are 2 metrics that go into that. Let's take this one, and that breaks down into, you know what I mean? Like there's no other tool that you can kind of do that nicely in. So just like a combination of, obviously, just theoretically they are good for communicating kind of data, but also like having the tool that really unlocks that kind of, which you've not necessarily had before. I think like that together allows you, if you build a MetricTree using Count, to go to like a stakeholder and say, hey, look at this, and they probably aren't going to have seen something like it before, which is obviously like is quite powerful.
Yeah, I think we think about it anyway, is just trying to get out of the way. Like I think it's probably so painful to do it in Tableau because it's not quite made for that kind of thing. So I think it's just about letting you go and let a tree be a tree and let all those, connections be clear and obvious and that kind of thing. But I really like that just do it approach. And and let it speak for itself, I think is really powerful. Okay, great. I wanted to jump to a new topic. And when we did our session on Thursday on building a tree live, we had quite a few questions on defining metrics and dependencies and how to think about this, and things like, oh, should it always be MECE? Do things always need to add up to 100%? How important is it to have everything like really defined and clear? Normalization, these kinds of questions came up quite a bit. And Michael, maybe we'll start with you on your thoughts on just how to define these metrics.
Yeah, I mean, I would say when you're starting, definitely go MECE and definitely go everything adds up to 100%. You're at the level of complexity that you add as soon as you start going away from that is huge. If you are getting stuck decomposing things, and like Callum has some good tips, but I've also found that sometimes take dimensions and make them metrics. So for example, you might have users as a really obvious one, and you can kind of break it down by the growth accounting steps, right? Like new, existing, like retained, churned, that's resurrected, that sort of thing. Like turning those into metrics makes it much easier, and you can kind of just keep diving deeper. So definitely always go MECE and stick to non-proxy, like actually being able to decompose, and then also be willing to go backwards. I think starting top down, but Will mentioned it in something like the product work, is sometimes a behavior that works and you kind of actually need to work backwards and say, how does that behavior and the other things I need to make happen, and then find the kind of in between where it then links to the metric where you started top down. So you go, it's not very linear. It takes practice and you'll need to do a bit of pruning, but just stick at it, and stick to the maths being nice and easy. It will work, pay dividends.
You mentioned proxy metrics. Can you say a bit more about what you mean by proxy metrics?
Yeah, so for example, if you're looking at, this will so often happen in the world of product where you don't have a very clear, this thing, we move this by 2%, it's going to ladder up to this other metric moving 10%, whatever it is. And so we try to say, oh, well, to get that metric, it would be too expensive. The timeline is too slow. We wouldn't be able to run experiments. So we need to have like a layer of abstraction, a metric which doesn't directly translate to that other thing. So this is where we come up with proxy metrics, and we say we think moving this thing is indicative of some other metric in the future. And once you start getting down that route, it gets very, very scary, because those metrics, you don't really know how well that correlation is going to hold. And it's something you need to monitor quite a lot in terms of how long does that relationship last? You start getting into, is it normally distributed versus a kind of power law? You need to consider all these things. And in particularly consumer products, you're often going to get power laws. So you need to start doing logs of the world or some normalization, and people get a bit confused. So get there eventually, but just don't start there.
Yeah, don't overcomplicate it, I guess. Yeah
Definitely.
Callum, I think you're kind of in a similar mindset to Michael here in terms of MECE and that kind of thing, but anything to add? I think you had a few tips for this as well.
Yeah, MECE is kind of worth shooting for. I think the advantage of keeping it MECE as well is that you can use the tree in in sizing. So like if you know that there's a mathematical formula that links kind of one layer to the next, then you can kind of start making statements like, okay, if we increase this by X%, then that will have a Y% increase on the metric above. And you, as was said earlier, like when you start getting away from that more mathematical link, like that kind of exercise becomes a little bit dicier. In terms of like actually thinking about how to go like from one layer to the next, I think typically I will try one of two or three kind of mathematical tricks just to keep it MECE. So an obvious way of doing that is kind of just like a simple addition. So like, just to take total sales as your like starting point, you could have, okay, total sales made through web, total sales made through store, total sales made through like telephone outreach. I'm showing my age there, I'm sorry. But like the idea is that you are accounting for all the different sales channels, and we know that if you sum all that together, you're going to get the number at the top. So that's one thing that I would have in mind. The other thing in mind that I use a lot is when you're trying to break down a ratio. So to take an example, like total revenue per customer as an example. So like when I'm thinking about breaking down some ratio A over B, a good technique is to introduce like a third element C. So, mathematically A over B equals A over C multiplied by C over B. So just to give like a concrete example for that. So if you had like revenue per user, you could introduce like total number of sales as your third kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So revenue per customer becomes like revenue per sale. So the average size of each sale multiplied by your sales per customer. So you've taken that total higher level metric and broken it down into two separate business kind of problems, right? So that's, is this number increasing because the average size of each order is increasing, or is it because you have an increase in the total number of orders per customer? So they're kind of like breaking down a higher order problem into like two separate business. And it's important that those two things are like business relevant. Like obviously, it's mathematically correct to add literally anything as your C in that, but obviously you need to create two things that kind of make sense in the business context. So yeah, those two things are definitely what I do, particularly for the first few levels. I would say I would break that kind of mathematical rule of probably 4 or 5 layers down. An example of this might be thinking about like retention as a metric. We know that there are certain things that drive retention. So like, you probably want to track stuff like customer satisfaction and NPS in a MetricTree. Like it's something that the business cares about, but like that doesn't mathematically really go anywhere, but you kind of know that it drives retention. So like maybe you have like a bit of a dotted line linking the two. Those would be an example of like where you might break the mathematical kind of linkage, but trying to keep it mathematical as long as possible, I would say is what I would try and do.
Yeah, I think it is about like holding those two things in tension, right? Like the business understanding and what's important to the business, and then also what's mathematically relevant. I think on that tension, Will, you had quite a different. I guess if Michael and Callum are kind of more on the mathematical side, I think the tree that you made is a bit more on the what works for the business. Like how is this going to help us more? So maybe you can talk us through your tree. Yeah.
It's funny. It sounds less mathematical, but it is actually, I would say, kind of mathematical. It's like you're making a formalism for what needs to be true to drive an outcome. So again, starting with kind of an outcome goal, as long as you've picked the right one and you're working backwards, you're then, I think, in a good place. And it has to be logically consistent, but I think that just to kind of, maybe make this useful for a wider or more general purpose audience. But I think as long as you know your goal, what are you trying to do? And then define metrics. And it'll always be, I think, a single metric you should start with. And then you want to work back and develop out the metrics. It's a process of you pathfinding and trying to understand, firstly, what are the metrics that matter? And you'll realize actually that some matter more than others, even though they fit logically in that tree and can be related. But it's very, I very much start with like a goal, then what is the metric for that? And again, just, in terms of our one at Movie though, it is a bit different. But what we've done is say, North Star metric, pretty clear for our business. Utility, it's viewing, there's a very clear thing we do. So there's very low risk, I think, with that. And then working backwards through, okay, what needs to be true to drive that? We know then you could say that's a sort of a nice simple formalism. People need to kind of be visiting the platform first and foremost, considering films. That's a dynamic we want to understand more. And then viewing, let's understand that aspect as well, and then have appropriate segmentations. And I think provided everything has a logical consistency, it works. But you're always working, I think, backwards from something. That's, I think, kind of essence of what a tree is. Otherwise, it loses its. But yeah, I think start with your goals and just to be true to your kind of moment. You can generally have a pretty good intuition for when you're veering off course or if it's not useful. And that's actually the key thing here is just understanding how you're going to use this. I think that's a really good test here. So if you're just starting with the top level North Star metric strategic tree. That's what we call. So these are for our strategic metrics, and I think it's important to draw a line under your use case because these can go on forever. The goal of that strategic tree is for us to know, okay, actually, we're going to use this to, well, every product, for instance, has to define itself in terms of what job it needs to do strategically. So, when we look at the strategic metrics and an actual product on the product roadmap, product manager has to say, okay, which part of the API tree is going to be? Is it going to move consideration to watch efficiency or something like that? Mm-hmm. And then, of course, say you ladder lower, there's lower levels of like detail that are relevant to, okay, actually for this product to be successful, there's probably some other metrics that are probably relevant there, but we don't want to cloud and confuse people at the strategic level.
Yeah.
And then you get that kind of, you can then, maybe there's another tree then for that part of the product that's, really important for viewing for you, and you decompose that and you can be truthful to that area as long as it's encapsulated, but then you're connected to this higher kind of strategic view. And that actually is a really, in the product space, I would definitely recommend when you're doing that North Star kind of production everywhere. Yeah, think about that like a strategic tree, and then actually you can create trees for other parts of your product as well.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. I also just wanted to mention, I think in your tree, how you've found out quickly how important, as you say, that the funnel was, and even segmentation. And so you think your tree structured is kind of unique because you worked out like, oh no, this is an important aspect to bring into the tree. So I just like that you had the flexibility and kind of confidence to say like, yes, this actually makes the most sense to how we understand this. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm saying like at that strategic, like again, just knowing kind of what do I want to do with this tree. Mm-hmm. Get a helpful barometer for kind of where you are with it, and if it's working for you. So in addition to just setting metrics for your other products, so understanding what the strategic goals should be, it should also be a guide, I think, to kind of the unknown questions. That's the big strategic insight. So that's our kind of ultimate test: is are we able to also look at here and say, right, actually we should be spending this insight time on trying to understand why that cohort of users is not visiting less. So how do we unpack that? And can we come up with some recommendations about some opportunities there? And that's the whole goal of all this, is how do you make the data more useful and understand how it relates to each other and where you should be prioritizing? Because I think it's funny, the data should always be, it should simplify decision making. It should make it easier to say kind of what we should focus on. But unless you've got a nice rigorous framework, which is what a MetricTree I think is an exercise in trying to do, mm-hmm. Then the data can be completely really confusing and everyone's just running around and it's actually a muck. But once you do that and you know what's important, everything then comes together.
Yeah, awesome. I have a question. So Thursday, when we were doing the live session, there was a question. We were building a tree for daily active users. I think we were looking at I think a conversion rate at some point. And there's a question about whether that kind of thing should be normalized, because obviously it's very subject to noise, and like if a cohort size is larger than expected or smaller, then that conversion rate's going to be noisy, might lead to like erroneous conclusions. What do you guys think about the approach to that situation?
I can take that first, I guess. I think it depends. That's a really cop-out answer, isn't it? It depends. I think it depends, firstly, on like how you have presented the tree. Like if you've got metrics that are legitimately like super volatile and super noisy, you might wonder if they are helpful to have in the tree at all. I would imagine that a particularly noisy metric is probably going to be lower order. It might be quite a long way down the tree anyway. If it is like a bit higher up, like if you've got a total like conversion rate across the entire user base that is like super noisy, then obviously like that is maybe an interesting finding of the tree itself and is worth investigation, because you'd probably expect, at least on a weekly kind of cadence or a monthly cadence, depending on the product, like a metric like conversion rate oughtn't be too noisy. So it may be revealing something that you didn't know about a particular metric, or it might be revealing something that you didn't know about the product or whatever. So yeah, that'd be my 2 cents on it.
Yeah, it's similar. We often use our tree to understand why certain and metrics have moved. And so being able to really quite quickly point to, oh, it's volume. And then we can say, oh, let's break down volume by, okay, country, let's say. I think that brings a lot of noise. So I would not want to, what's the purpose of the tree? The tree is to kind of like understand why these metrics are moving. And so if volume is quite volatile, that's really good to know, and know where that's happening and why. I think you want it to surface those things.
I would say on a really practical level as well, like they are the kind of metrics where in a traditional dashboard, like you could have a bit of movement, which is just due to volatility or is just due to like something a bit random. And in my experience, they're the kind of metrics where like a senior person will see it, get scared, and demand an instant explanation and investigation into said metric. And in the old world, like that's the kind of thing that can basically like kill a working day for an analyst because they're having to spend it on that. Obviously, if you've got it in a structured tree like this that is set up in a self-serve way, like what Michael said around, okay, is this an issue with volume? Is this an issue with market? Is this an issue with yada, yada, yada? Like it's plainly visible, like what's going on. So like you can use a tool like this, just like shortcut a bunch of those steps. Maybe it needs like half an hour to look into, but like in terms of time saves and like maybe allaying the fears that can result in some kind of thrashy kind of decisions, like they can be a useful tool in that fight, I think.
Yeah, just to add really quick, I think most of the points were covered, but I think, yeah, again, the whole point is that you should see the key close neighboring metrics that all interact with each other and be able to immediately understand whether, okay, right, this increase, was it meaningful or was it actually anomalous or whatever. And I would always say, I think this was brought up actually in our pre-huddle, but often actually things will usually ladder up to an aggregate metric, almost always, just mathematically. And so that's always tricky because someone says, hey, surely the North Star should just be gross, blah, 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 or aggregate watches. But actually then you say, and you go down the tree and you say, actually, well, you can have the rate or the frequency or the adoption rate or engagement rate side of it, but that is not the full story either. But so again, it's all about showing that in a clear framework, and a simple thing for us that works. I think that's used in general is there's the aggregate top level metric, and then it has its derived, frequency and adoption metrics, and actually, yeah, usually things you can usually cover most bases with that kind of approach. But yeah, no, super.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of the mindset shift, right? It's in a dashboard, you'd be forced to try to explain so much in such a small space that you might have to normalize. You might have to do something like that to try to shortcut or prevent or preempt those questions. But I guess with this, you want to make all that really visible. What are the trade-offs? What is everything leading into this? So you're hopefully, you have no need to do those kinds of things. Yeah, the same way. Okay, great. We're on to our last question. So just another call for any questions in the chat. If there's anything, if this isn't the last question that you had and you have another one, so please go ahead and drop it in the chat. And then, yeah, the last question for you guys, what's one last piece of advice you'd give to someone starting their first metric tree? Callum, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. I kind of had, sorry, another question is one last piece. I've got two things. So yeah, that's fair enough. So like, I think when constructing them, it's helpful, almost kind of like a jigsaw puzzle, just to like empty all the pieces on the table. So like, these are the metrics that I kind of know the business cares about, and then try and piece those together in such a way that like you have kind of these relationships between the metrics in the tree. That could be useful just to like help you get started, but it's also useful just to make it as relevant to the business and your stakeholders as possible. It's just like, I know this person cares about conversion, or I know they care about like churn or whatever, and it's just like, if you've starting with the mindset that, okay, I'm going to include those things in this tree, it obviously helps make that relevant for your stakeholders, and obviously buy-in becomes easier. And the last point that I'd make is just like, when you are doing this for the first time, like it's actually not as easy as we make it sound, I would say. Like when I was kind of talking about, this partner at this consultancy where I started, like he would train us by like literally saying these as like exercises. Like I maybe did like 5 before he kind of looked at it on this little sheet of paper that I'd done. And he was like, "Oh, yeah, that's all right." So like,
Do you mean
I'd say,
the defining of the metrics itself is not as easy as it sounds, or which part of it?
I would say just like constructing it, making sure you're starting with the right thing, like making sure, you know, when you come to break down something into 2 component parts, like there is a choice there. Like sometimes the choice is very obvious and sometimes it isn't. And like you kind of get a bit of intuition after you've done it a few times as to like what is likely to be successful. But yeah, I guess the summary of that advice is just like it can take a few goes to get it right, and like that's fine. So yeah, it's kind of a bit of practice and a bit of trial and error sometimes, but yeah, that's what I'd say.
Nice. Will, how about you?
If I echo those points, I think for just starting really conceptually, sticky notes, starting with count. But I think starting with sticky notes, you know, starting with an outcome. I think be clear about your goals. So are you, again, building a strategic view of your metrics? Whatever you're doing, whatever exercise, you'll probably go, you'll try to bring clarity to your metrics. You're trying to decide what is important and trying to represent that. So yeah, design it well from the beginning, but iterate with stakeholders and ideally with a single stakeholder around a kind of clear, focused aim. You don't need to have everything in the single metric tree initially, but that might be an ambition that you might want to have. We certainly actually initially wanted to have like a complete view of everything in our business, but realized that there were some technical considerations to the actual loading of the tree. But actually, we've realized you can actually do a lot more in count. Actually, I might come back to it. But I think focus is important because these things can go on, being clear and logical consistency. But yeah, start with a clear goal. You know, North Star one might be a nice project. Work backwards from that North Star metric as long as you're sure it's the right North Star metric, and think about who your initial stakeholders are, and be truthful to what you're trying to achieve, which is you are trying to create a tool for either setting metrics and goals in this context for like other products, or trying to identify where you should be investing your insight time, at least if you were doing a North Star framework. Those would be
I really like as well. I know one of the things you told me when we spoke about your tree in the past is when you started building it, it was kind of something you did every Friday, and you would just work on it every Friday, and kind of creating a ritual around it, I think is also something I've seen really effective, both in when you're building it, but then also when you go to review it as a team, just to know like, hey, it's Friday, we review this. And that's how we now do our internal metric tree that we've built. We just say like every Friday at this time, like that's what we're doing. We're checking it out. So I think that's also a good thing that you've done that I really like.
And that was a good way of also learning count, by the way.
Yeah. Just every Friday. Yeah. Michael, how about you?
Nothing too original. So I echo a lot of that. I think, you know, start with an aggregate number like dollars users. Stick to, you know, mathematical things as long as possible. You'll build the intuition of when something should be a dimension that you can filter on versus when you split it out into a metric itself, like, you know, new users versus existing, blah blah blah. And yeah, don't have one tree to rule them all. It just, I mean, you might be able to get there. Just make it easy for yourself. Don't do it.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, I don't see any questions in the chat. I'm happy to ask you guys one more then, if you're up for it. So maybe just in one sentence or a few kind of bullet points, what impact have you seen metric trees have in your organization? Maybe Michael, you're off mute. Maybe I'll start with you.
I mean, not to push Count's content too much, but Count has, I think, you know, Taylor, you can probably speak to this better than any of us. You've written this really good post about like driving operational clarity, and I think it really, really resonates. And when you do something like this, you'll see all the things like in that post sort of come true. For me, I think like very quickly, it's been, you know, answering why a metric has changed. That becomes trivial. Getting alignment on the business of sort of how our business works and what's important, even with product teams, and finding points of leverage. And then easily understanding the relationship between metrics. So, you know, when user volume goes up, conversion rate likely goes down, those sort of things, that all becomes very, very easy. So
nice. Callum?
Yeah, I'd echo most of that, I think. yeah, it's around like just bringing a clarity and understanding to like a wider organization about like how stuff is interlinked, and how like an effect in one place can have an impact elsewhere. Like just putting that down on very clearly on paper, if you like, is something that I think is hard to do otherwise. So yeah, there's lots of like implications from that as far as like, you know, planning your activities as a product manager, or like having an understanding as to what initiative should be focused on if you're like a commercially minded person. But like the TLDR is that it's around clarity of the relationships between metrics.
Nice, agree. Will, yeah.
I'd say again, the main impact being us kind of shifting towards a more engagement-based view of our business and certainly in our product and in the product org. So having an engagement North Star versus like a business metric North Star, like memberships or just revenue. Those are important, but again, for our purposes and product, we're trying to attribute all the elements of the product to, you know, in our case, like what you come to do at Mubi, which is you come to watch films. And the more we can understand how different elements of a product drive that, I think the more successful we'll be, and actually the data will be a more powerful tool. So I think that's been really the main shift. Again, there's still a dialogue going on here. Our business, like all the other businesses here as well, are very dynamic businesses. But I think, that's been the big shift. And certainly I think the big test was, we were shifting and we realized, like, how do we deal with retention, and that is a very sort of a metric that really, I think it's very hard to attribute all the elements that go into retention for a product like a streaming product. And so we were able to kind of take what we've done here with this engagement view and able to really clearly say, like, and identify priorities actually for all the different teams. That was, I think, a good litmus test for kind of this being the right direction. And again, us being focused on actually the best thing we can probably do as a business from a data perspective is just focus on the consumer utility of what you do on Mubi, and then retention and all that stuff. LTV should take care of itself.
Yeah, just to echo, I think something I find often with product orgs is with you give them the confidence of like the right thing to focus on, and that the scoreboard takes care of itself. That phrase, it is quite a big game changer in how you function. And people feel you stop getting the questions of like, are we focused on the right things? Well, it's just comes back to the impact of, did we move the metric we said we wanted, which is actually really, really hard to do. And then we know, okay, once you've moved it, it is going to have an impact. So it makes a big difference.
Yeah, I think it's hard to it's almost something you have to feel. Like, I don't think it's not easy to explain how, like, the cognitive load of trying to keep this all in your head all the time. So I think just relieving that stress and then be able to focus on how do I best deliver to these goals. I think it's being able to focus like that is a really big impact I've seen. Well, cool. We are almost out of time. Thank you all for coming out. Thanks for everyone who's joined in. Thanks to you three in particular. I really appreciate your time. You give such good wisdom here, good advice. There's lots of blog posts in the making with this content, so it will live on in many forms. I hope you're ready for that. And up next, Michael did allude to operational clarity. So this is kind of an idea that underpins MetricTrees, as well as some other concepts of just how do you make your business as clear and transparent as possible. And that's not just about MetricTrees. There's some other concepts that go into that as well. So the last session in this series is going to be on Thursday. And it's going to be with our CEO, Oliver Hughes, and he's going to be talking us through what operational clarity is, what are some other ways that you can apply that, and I think how it can really change how data teams operate, especially if you feel like you're in kind of a service trap or you feel like you're just kind of constantly churning out dashboards. This is a really good way to kind of shift out of that way of working. And that's it. You'll all get a recording link in the next day or so. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or reach out to any of these three as well. And thank you all.
Thanks, Tyler. Cheers.
Thanks, Tyler.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Right.